Welcome to Cool Talk. It's been a while. Yes, I've been busy, but here we are with the rise of the United States in the 1800s. After the American Revolution, the new republic stumbled its way into what was later called the Great Experiment. No king, no monarch. Several states united as one. There was and still is argument as to how much power the executive should have. Once a constitution was adopted, George Washington, former commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, became the first president of the United States, and the U.S. was lucky to have him. He was called the father of our country. He was an able administrator. He sought advice, kept the U.S. out of European conflict, gave the country time to strengthen. He kept everything level. He approved Alexander Hamilton's proposal for the first bank of the United States. He suffered feuds within the cabinet, advised against partisanship. He made treaties with the Native American tribes. And as for slavery, he tried to appease the South, but at the same time tried to curtail the expansion of slavery. After 2 terms, he decided not to run for a third. The U.S. fought to a stalemate in the War of 1812, and then President James Monroe, signed the Monroe Doctrine, saying that any attack on a South American nation would be seen as an attack on the U.S. itself. Then Napoleon Bonaparte of France needed money, so he sold his property in the Americas to the United States, doubling the size of the U.S. This expansion came to the Indian Removal Act of 1830, an effort to remove the Indians from the Southeast. President Andrew Jackson's tactics were that if Indians did not sign the treaties and move amicably, they would be forced to. So thousands died in the relocation on the Cherokee Trail of Tears, when 16,000 Cherokees were moved west, and 2,000 to 8,000 died along the way. In all, about 60,000 Native Americans were moved from their homeland at that time. There was strong resistance from the Seminole Indians, which resulted in the Seminole Wars. 3 wars fought between 1816 and 1842. It ended with an American victory and the Seminoles settling in today's Florida. And during these dealings with the Native Americans, slavery was still a divisive issue. Even before the American Revolution, Quakers, abolitionists, and others were anti-slavery, residing mostly in the North, while slavery expanded in the cotton plantations of the South. There were compromises as new territories became states, the Compromise of 1820, the Compromise of 1850. But in the middle of all this, African Americans were treated harshly, horribly, as property. And while the South enriched itself on the back of the slaves of permanent labor, generations of Black Americans were born into and died in slavery, drudging day-to-day work, denied even the basic elements of any education, limited mobility, whippings, lynchings, families torn apart, and slaves, even children, could be sold off at any moment as mortgage loans. The United States purchased Florida from Spain. Now, Florida did not look like the beaches that we think of today. It looked mostly like this. Now, this is Mexico back then. Well, wars were fought over the area of Texas. You probably already know the story of the Alamo and the resistance. We acquired Texas as a state. Then later on came U.S. and Mexican war over California. We acquired it, of course, won it over, and then came the California Gold Rush. Afterwards, we purchased Alaska from Russia, and this was called Seward's Folly. Secretary of Interior's Seward purchased Alaska, recommended it at 2 cents an acre. He said it was a bargain. People thought it was ridiculous. However, with the fishing industry, pelt industry, it was a big bargain, and later on, oil was discovered in Alaska, so you can imagine. And then came the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Kansas was going to be admitted as a state. Would it be a free state? Would it be a slave state? Everybody bumped heads over it. It was admitted as a free state, but this led to bleeding Kansas. Violence. In Congress, anti-slavery Senator Charles Sumner was beaten with a cane by another congressman, savagely. Abolitionist John Brown and his sons seized 5 pro-slavery men from their homes and hacked them to death. Slave rebellions, such as those of Gabriel Prosser, Denmark Vesey, and Nat Turner, terrified the white South. Then came the election of 1860. Anti-slavery Abraham Lincoln became president, and several southern states decided to secede, leave the Union, and form their own Confederate States of America, with their own constitution, their own laws, and their own president, Jefferson Davis. April 12, 1861, Lincoln sends reinforcements to South Carolina to Fort Sumter. 100,000 Confederates attack. Lincoln called for more reinforcements, and the Civil War began. The North, the Union, was relatively successful in the East, winning major battles at Perryville and Shiloh. But Major General George McClellan failed to capture major Confederate cities, such as the capital in Richmond, Virginia. He retreated continuously after several battles. Confederate Southern General Robert E. Lee won many battles, including the major Battle of Fredericksburg, but he lost badly at Gettysburg. Meanwhile, in the North, industry expanded as railroad communications and munitions were needed. Britain would trade with the U.S. And as money poured in with trade, General Ulysses S. Grant gained control of the Mississippi River at the Battle of Vicksburg. Then General Sherman marched through Georgia, destroying everything in his path. Nobody expected the death toll to be as high as it was. If you pause and look at these battles, look at the number of dead. Especially focus on Gettysburg, where the number of dead could be over 51,000. In total, between 560 and 620,000 soldiers were killed. Many were maimed. And if you look at these final photos over here, these two men actually survived, but many had died of starvation, especially prisoners of war. Now, when Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation stating that the millions of slaves in the South were now free, this was ineffective because everybody ignored it. But later on, the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution was passed through Lincoln's strength and mediation. It abolished slavery for millions and saved millions of future generations from slavery. It passed both houses on January of 1865. And after 4 years of battle, Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant signed the peace treaty. But to these hundreds of thousands of dead, we have to add one more. Lincoln, who had recently been reelected, went to a theater with his wife and was assassinated. His successor, Vice President Andrew Johnson, becomes president, and he faced a radical Republican Congress and became the first president to be impeached. He avoided being removed from office by one vote. Now, the South was angry. White supremacist groups like the KKK emerged. Jim Crow laws were passed. They were imposed, disenfranchising African Americans, making voter registration difficult, and effectively segregating African Americans for over 100 years. Well, westward expansion did not stop. Native Americans were placed into reservations. And with communication and transportation needed, the Transcontinental Railroad was built. And if you look at these pictures over here, you'll notice that a lot of the workers were Chinese. Many Chinese helped build the Transcontinental Railroad. But in the inauguration of the railroad, if you look at this final photo, you'll notice there's not a Chinese person in sight. Now, throughout the world, but mainly from the United States, came the Industrial Revolution. The country began to prosper with several inventions in the 19th and early 20th century. The telephone, the motion picture camera, the locomotive, the reaper, photographs, films, sewing machines, ice-making machines, machine guns, dynamite, cotton gins, microphones, barbed wire, phonograph, electric fans, fountain pens, trolley cars, telegraph, gasoline engines, a submarine, and many, many more. New York's Brooklyn Bridge was begun in the late 19th century. But with all of this steel and all of this construction and all of this industry, the environmental hazards that we're facing today began with the Industrial Revolution. First wave feminism began in the late 19th century and continued to the 20th century with Lucy Stone, Elizabeth Stanton, and Susan B. Anthony. But few states would grant women the vote. Women would picket outside the White House. They were arrested as political prisoners and force-fed. But it would take World War I and the participation of women on the front lines of Europe for all women across the United States to finally get the vote. By 1890, the United States became a world economic and military power, subsequently acquiring the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam. It participated in the Spanish-American War in Cuba, began planning the building of the Panama Canal, and increased trade with Asia, especially Japan. So, by the time World War I, which I'm dying to talk about, began, the United States was a world power to be reckoned with. But before we get there, we have to first pause and talk a little bit about the Industrial Revolution and the advancement of the art. Well, that's it. In the meantime, send me your comments, negative, positive, or better yet, subscribe. This is Cool Talk.